Ava Homa is an award-winning novelist, a journalist, and an activist. Her words have appeared in the Globe and Mail, BBC, The Guardian, Literary Hub, Literary Review of Canada, and more. She has spoken about women's rights across North America and Europe, including at the United Nations in Geneva. Ava has a master's degree in creative writing from the University of Windsor, and her debut novel, Daughters of Smoke and Fire, the story of a Kurdish woman's search for justice and freedom, won the 2020 Nautilus Book Award, was a finalist for the 2022 William Saroyan International Writing Prize, and was Roxane Gay's book club pick.
Ava, I was so moved by your novel and by your powerful and eye-opening essay, Unveiling Through Voice, Writing as Resistance by Iranian Women. Especially, I love this quote of yours. Once I started to write myself, I began to realize how this powerful act of self-expression was the counter opposite of the seclusion, alienation, and repression that mandatory veiling had imposed on me. And you coined that fabulous phrase, unveiling through voice. I wonder if you might share some of the historical intersection of women poetry and resistance in Iran.
Thank you, Judith, for your kind remarks, and thanks, Catherine, for the introduction. Yeah, it's very important to me that when oppression thinks that it has won and it has silenced people, artists and creators and intellectuals and activists find ways around that and find new ways to express themselves. I think it's no coincidence that in modern Iranian history, the first woman in modern times who publicly unveiled herself was a poet. Tahira Qurrat al-Ain from the Baha'i religious minority showed up without her veiling at a man's gathering, but it's important that her presence was also voice, that she had initially found self-expression through voice. Another poet that's very important to me is Forough Farrokhzad. She has been one of the most both revered and reviled poets of mid-20th century in Iran. She had a short and remarkable life, and she also, because she broke a lot of shackles that society has put on women's hands and feet, she became such a subject of controversy. On one hand, she was highly admired, on the other hand, she was really feared. And I pay tribute to these authors and a lot of authors, especially the very little known Kurdish authors and poets in my book, Daughters of Smoke and Fire, because it's important for me to remind myself the reason I can do today what I can is because I stand on the shoulder of giants, that there have been so many other authors and women and poets who have fought and paid for it heavily, like Shor's mother is paying, by creating a little bit of space for the rest of us today.
Oh, that's marvelous. I mean, would you tell us some more about Forough? She seems to be the mother of modern Iranian poetry. Is that true? And if so, would you read one of her poems?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. She is initially the Islamic Republic, when they took over in 1979, for about 10 years, they banned her poetry. But that made her even more and more a subject of curiosity. I mean, for me growing up, she was the icon of personal freedom, sexual freedom, and also artistic liberation. She had a short and tormented life. So as I'm saying, she really paid a heavy price for it, but she paved the way for the rest of us. And I'll be honored to read her poem, Another Bird. My whole being is a dark chant which will carry you, perpetuating you to the dawn of eternal growth and blossoming. In this chant, I sighed you sigh. In this chant, I grafted you to the tree, to the water, to the fire. Life is perhaps a long street through which a woman holding a basket passes every day. Life is perhaps a rope with which a man hangs himself from a branch. Life is perhaps a child returning home from school. Life is perhaps lighting up a cigarette in the narcotic repose between two lovemakings, or the absent gaze of a passerby, who takes off his hat to another passerby with a meaningless smile and a good morning. Life is perhaps that enclosed moment when my gaze destroys itself in the people of your eyes, and it is in this feeling which I will put into the moon's impression and the night's perception. In a room as big as loneliness, my heart, which as big as love, looks at the simple pretexts of its happiness, at the beautiful decay of the flowers in the vase, at the sapling you planted in our garden, at the song of canaries which sing to the sides of a window. Ah, this is my lot, this is my lot, this is my lot. My lot is a sigh which is taken away at the drop of a curtain. My lot is going down a flight of disused stairs, I regain something amidst petrification and nostalgia. My lot is a sad promenade in the garden of memories and dying in the grief of a voice which tells me, I love your hands. I will plant my hands in the garden. It will grow, I know, I know, I know, and swallows will lay eggs in the hollow of my ink-stained hands. I shall wear a pair of twin cherries as my earrings, and I shall put dial-up petals on my fingernails. There is an alley where the boys who were in love with me still loiter, with the same unkempt hair, thin necks, and bony legs, and think of the innocent smile of a little girl who was blown away by the wind one night. There is an alley which my heart has stolen from the streets of my childhood. The journey of a form along the line of time, inseminating the line of time with the form, a form conscious of an image coming back from a feast in a mirror. And it is in this way that someone dies and someone lives on. No fisherman shall ever find a pearl in a small brook which empties into a pool. I know a sad little fairy who lives in an ocean and ever so softly plays her heart into a magic flute, a little sad fairy who dies with one kiss each night and is reborn with one kiss each dawn.
Life is perhaps lighting up a cigarette in the narcotic repose between two
Love making.
Oh, I'm so grateful to you for turning me on to Farouk's work. I've bought her books and now I'm reading her. Thank you for this so much.
You love it. My pleasure.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about was in your essay, Unveiling the Voice, you speak so eloquently about your own unveiling. And I wonder if you might just say a little more of that and then maybe read for us a bit from Daughters of Smoke and Fire and the epigraph. I love the epigraph.
Thank you. I'll be honored to. Yes, it was really hard growing up in a misogynistic and utterly chauvinistic country, growing up as a woman and as a Kurdish woman, a Kurdish minority. And so it felt very suffocating. And it was in literature when I found a redemptive world where I could take a pause and peel layers and understand maybe how things were the way they were. But as I read, I was also a very curious reader. And as I read more and more of Persian literature and literature in English, as I went to college and learned English, I realized that no one has written Kurdish women into literature. And I thought it's upon us to do that. And I'm so happy that Farangis is here today and I have been able to do the same thing. And so I wrote the story of what it's like to be a Kurd in Iran in Daughters of Smoke and Fire. And when Gina's story happened, and I knew that, like the quote you mentioned, Judith, she's not going to die, she will transcend. And that in that transcendence, I have given her a home in literature. And so Daughters of Smoke and Fire is in so many ways a tribute to someone like Gina, to a lot of women who fight on the page and off the page. And the one page that I would read for you from the prologue is the story of Layla. Layla likes to become a filmmaker and tells the story of her people to the world, but obstacles pile up. Her brother, Chia, attends a protest and he's kidnapped. And now it's upon Layla to try and see where he is and what has happened to him. And while doing that, she puts her own life in danger. So this is a very difficult moment for her, this part that I'm going to read to you. A woman alone on the mountain at dusk. An invisible boot pressed against my throat, making my breath labored and helpless. And yet I could not go back and face my parents or my stifled future. Hidden behind the boulder, I hugged my knees and imagined my rage and peril whirling into a wildfire, burning down all the injustices. Could my father have known what was going on? I wanted to tell him, to share this burden with him. My shoulders were already heavy beneath the daily cruelties of living as a woman in Lanatawa, the damn place. This fatigue was incurable. The sun had sundered down, disappeared behind Lake Zebar. A dozen shades of red burst open along the horizon. Below, the narrow, winding asphalt road was the hem around the hill's green skirt, embroidered with clusters of red and yellow wildflowers. The Schleer flowers, the crown lilies, stood elegant and tall, flourishing across the rough Kurdistan plateau, defying borders. I yearned to be a Schleer, but I was a garden of anguish, of loathing, of torment. My occupied homeland was a birthplace of death. I stood up, my breath now coming intense. I wasn't hiding anymore. Bessa, best, I shouted, it's enough, enough. I started down the hill in a tumbling round and found myself unable to stop. Despite the chill of the evening, I started sweating. The wind whipped my headscarf and I gained speed. I flapped as if I had wings. As I ran, a wail escaped my chest. I was headed toward the main road, toward the world of men. The streets belonged to men, judgmental men, hypocritical men. Their honor depended on women, men. Cars hurtled around the curve, full of drunk drivers who honked as they spotted me sprinting down the hillside. Those drivers were going too fast for this road, too fast for their old sluggish reflexes, too fast for their vehicles. A white late model car careened down the winding road, kicking up dust. The wind roared in my ears. The white car and whoever was driving it seemed to seek me out as a fellow traveler. I stumbled on a stone, crushing the shiny red poppies in the grass, and as I lurched, my untold stories tumbled inside me like pages ripped from a book and tossed, crumpled into a waste paper bin. An overpowering urge to scream my story, to expel it from beginning to end, seized me. Suddenly, I could see the head of all those Kurds crushed behind trunks. Descending the slope at a breakneck pace, my shouts crescendoing, I was unable to stop myself, this crazed woman. A final lunge, and I was airborne. Thank you for listening.
Oh, Ava.
Fabulous. That's really gorgeous writing. A novel, but it really was poetry. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that. I actually grew up reading more poetry than fiction, so.
We can really the page.
Thank you. Yeah. One of the questions, I think it was directed to Ava, but it might also be an interesting question for everyone. The question was, do you write a poem in English and translate it? What language do you write in first? And then do you translate it, or does somebody else translate it? That was a question that one person asked. And I think it was directed to Ava, so maybe Ava could answer that first.
Yeah, so I have been writing since childhood, and there have been stages to my writing. Initially, I also wrote in Persian because that was the language of education. I didn't have access to my mother tongue. And later in life, interestingly enough, after exile, I had, because up until then, all I was doing was surviving. And there came a moment of tranquility that allows me to go deeper, investigate my identity. And I realized how much this lack of access to mother tongue was hurting me on so many deep levels. And so I made a point of teaching myself Kurdish. So then I started writing in Kurdish, and then came the sense of, wait a minute, I have this gift of being able to write in English because I majored in English and I have always loved writing and English literature. And because I grew up in Kurdistan and now I live in North America, maybe I can be a bridge. Because a lot of people who grow up in North America and grow up with English, they don't have access to an authentic Kurdish world. And the ones who, like me, grew up there, they don't have access to English language. And so since then, which was about 15 years ago, I shifted to writing in English. So now when I write in English, I write in English, I don't translate. I think in English and plan it in English. And when I write in Kurdish, I think in Kurdish. When I write in Farsi, I think in Farsi. I haven't done a lot of translation. It's a whole different mental power for translators. I am so amazed by translators.
Thank you. And anyone else? Go ahead, Judith.
I'm going to ask a friend of ours, wonderful poet herself, Wezi, from Malawi, has asked Farangis, you said that leaving home was a hard decision that you had to make. Have you been able to cope in exile? And do you find the work you do fulfilling? And the same, she wants to hear from all of you on your experiences of exile in relation to your work.
Thank you. I guess what I do is a way of coping, both my research and the translation. But it is a very difficult, very painful journey. It's not easy.
It makes the far away near, but also makes you always know that it's far. What about you, Fatemeh? Fatemeh E. You're living in Norway. That has to be just a radical.
Yeah.
exile.
Can you repeat the question?
Well, she wanted to know what's the relationship of your living in exile to your work.
Yeah, of course, the experience of a writer has some effects on what you write, but it's not just my own experience. I use for writing, I use some other inspiration, like the others' life, the others' experiences, and also my imagination. So I have these two, and I can use these two from the other side of the world, not just from Iran, but I have my own experience that right now is in Norway, and of course with new people, with new language, with new literature atmosphere, and of course this effect on my works.
Scheherazade.
Yes, so I guess I would say it really has a multidimensional effect, if you like, in the sense that, sure, on the surface, the very first thing that it affects is the loss of mother tongue, that I think a lot of exiles from different lands have experienced and gone through that. And it's really the most painful, I would say, experience of exile for me too, has been the change and the sort of slow deterioration of the mother tongue and the relationship that you have with your mother tongue over time. I have been, and it really depends on the geography of your exile and how much time you spend. So my relationship 3-4 years ago and 10 years ago and now has changed significantly with Iran and with Persian language. On the other hand, I think exile could be also empowering and liberating in the sense that it brings a part of the self on the surface where you could not experience if you never experienced exile, and opening you to other languages, other possibilities of imagination, and thinking about poetry and relating to poetry in a different way. when you have a chance to communicate and interact with poets of other languages. And then I think for all of us on this panel, also the relationship that we have with the translation, whether we are the translated subject or we are the translator, and you know the relationship. I see in the comments somebody asked, why didn't I translate my own poetry and I translate other people's poetry? It's a terrific question. I could never translate my own poetry, and the reason is that I will write a completely entirely different poem if I start writing it in English. And I have tried to do that. I mean, the subject matter could be the same, but the way that the poem is written in Persian, in my mind, and in English, I will deal with that subject matter differently, given you know what language I'm writing in. So I think those are all fascinating findings and understandings of exile for me, in relation to poetry and language.
That's a fantastic question. I wanted to ask you, Ava, the passion and the scholarship and the clarity in your essay, The Path to Freedom in Iran is through women and minorities. And I just wondered if you would speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been, like my fellow panelists discussed, this rising up has been both inspiring and devastating. And it takes a lot for some of us to put ourselves together and think about it and maybe create some kind of distance, artistic distance from it, to be able to look at it and see what might change this time. And I stand by my words that the more I look at what is happening, that I see that intersectionality is the difference between winning and losing. It's the difference between actually bringing about democracy or just a pretense of it. Having one of the advantages, and I love how Fatemeh articulated this, one of the advantages of having lived elsewhere and then picking up your life and having to put down roots elsewhere is, especially for some of us who have experienced life in the East and all the flavors of the East, and then here in the West, it's like having access to the left and right side of the collective human brain, right? And so things that inspire me are pretty much international, and I really believe in my heart the idea of oneness and connectivity and interbeing and interrelatedness. And it's not hard for those of us who have lived between countries to see that interconnectedness, not just in an intellectual level, but to actually embody it and see what affects you or someone in Zimbabwe today will indirectly affect me. So I'm going to go back to that idea of injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. In Iran, when in the 1980s, when the Islamic Republic first took over, two groups stood up to it. One was the Kurds. First, they were against this government from its very beginning, but they were alone. They were alone until 2022, when the funeral of Jinnah started this massive protest. And women in Iran also, when hijab became mandatory, and it became mandatory in stages, it wasn't right away made completely mandatory. In 1980, women staged a very large scale protest against it, but men failed to support that. They thought this is not a priority. And so that failing to understand that what happens to women today, what happens to Kurds today is going to affect all of us 15 years or so, 40 years from now. Not seeing that perspective empowers the oppressive regime and weakens connection, weakens interconnection. And today we have this young generation who has the intuition and understanding that if we centralize, marginalize groups, we empower everyone. And I see our society, on one hand, understanding that and embracing minorities and women one day, and the day after being full of fear and pushing them aside and embracing them. So there's this expansion and contraction. And if we can actually put our fears aside, and we can actually trust women and minorities, we will have true democracy.
I want to ask